Okay, I think we're good. So you might be thinking, why is this a Fighting Chance Zoom, but there's different branding on the screen? So I just have to acknowledge that I also, while also working at Fighting Chance, I also work somewhere else called DSC, and stands for Disability Services Consulting, and they have very generously allowed me to share their slides on this topic with all of us tonight, because this was a webinar that we gave to the disability community, to the support coordinator community a couple of months ago. So that's why you're seeing branding that is not Fighting Chance, because they've let us use their slides. And it was me and my colleague Kylie who did this. That's why you see those names there. So you may have noticed when you came into this Zoom meeting that it gave you an alert that the meeting's being recorded, and you had the right to say that you didn't want to join the meeting if you didn't want to be recorded. But if you're not wanting to be recorded, your name and your face, you can turn your camera off and you can rename yourself if you don't want there to be any evidence that you were here. And to do that, you hover the mouse over the box where it's got your name, and you'll see 3 little white dots next to each other in the little blue box. And you can click that and you can select rename if you want to name yourself something else. So if you want to keep your privacy, but yeah, just so you know, this meeting is being recorded simply so we can share the information with other families at Fighting Chance who can't be here tonight. So a bit of housekeeping. I've got a couple of Fighting Chance friends here with me tonight, Susanna and Alessandra, and they're going to help monitor the chat if you guys have any questions. So best thing is, if you do have a question, to type it into the chat function that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. And we'll periodically check there to see what the questions are. And also, if we don't get to those, if we have any unanswered questions, then we'll have a record of those and we'll be able to look into those and send you an email after tonight. And as I've said, make sure you're muted, otherwise we will hear your microwave and all of those sorts of things. And there is the function, if you want to use the function, to raise your hand to ask a question too. So you can either do that or use the chat. So this is me. So I am officially the NDIS support manager at Fighting Chance, and I've been at Fighting Chance for almost 6 years. Before that was a caseworker in the pre-NDIS world in New South Wales state-based disability funded support. So some of you guys might have been part of the community options program, so complex disability casework in families, for about 10 years before the NDIS. And then before that, I was a physio, but never really should have been. I've ended up in the right spot. So coming to you guys in a role from Fighting Chance that is mostly around supporting people with access to the NDIS for the first time, and also a lot of support for people around NDIS reviews. And also working with Susanna and Ali, who are in here tonight, around trying to create more community education for Fighting Chance families. So that's what we're hopefully doing tonight. So why are we doing these? I have been in the NDIS at Fighting Chance since it rolled out, and as the years go by, I'm actually finding that the complexities are increasing, and I'm also finding that the idea of knowledge being power is getting more and more important. So information is power, knowledge is power. So I go to many NDIS planning meetings each year, and I don't notice much change around the level of education that is happening in those meetings. And so I guess when we hear that the NDIS is all about choice and control, I don't really think there can be true choice and control unless people understand the system and unless people know how to navigate the system. So that's what this is all about. We're trying to give you guys information so that you can be empowered. And a very good friend of mine is an NDIS participant, and him and I always joke that Hamilton the musical can be relevant to the NDIS. So just in case you haven't seen Hamilton the musical, I'll explain why. So there's a scene in Hamilton the musical where one of the characters sings the line, "Why do you assume that you're the smartest in the room?" And so my friend and I have a dream that all NDIS participants and their supports and their families can be in a planning meeting and have the confidence to say to their assessors, "Why do you assume that you're the smartest in the room?" Because we want people to feel super empowered with all of the information about what's happening in the NDIS so that you can be. the smartest person in the room, and you are already the expert around your own situation, but sometimes the information delivered by the NDIS is so confusing and unclear that it disempowers people, and they then stop feeling like the expert. And I've seen this happen many times. So that's what we're aiming for. And there is another song in Hamilton the musical where they say that they want to be in the room where it happens. So to feel confident in the NDIS assessment rooms where things happen, you need to understand what's happening. So I'm trying to translate to you guys a lot of recent changes that are happening with plan reviews. So that's what tonight's all about. We're going to try and run a community education night like this once a month. So next month is all about some changes that have happened to the legislation, the NDIS Act, and the final topics for the rest of the year were only finalised today. So watch this space with the family and friends newsletters that come out. So, as I said, this is something that came to us from my work with DSC. And when you get the slides, you'll notice that we've got 2 links here for you. So these 2 links here are from the DSC newsletter. So the first one is an article all about the changes to the plan review process that was written back in May. And within about 2 weeks of that being published, it was already a bit out of date. And that just goes to show how much things are changing. So then the second link there is an article that came out this morning, written by myself and my colleague, the friend who talks about Hamilton the musical with me, about all of the things that have changed since May. So we're trying to stay up to date. So shameless plug, DSC has a free newsletter, and anything that changes in the NDIS or anything that needs to be translated, there'll be an article written about it that you can get if you subscribe to that newsletter. So what's this all about? So for those of you who have been part of the NDIS for longer than a year, you will be used to this idea that you have an NDIS plan that has a start date and an end date. And before the plan got to its end date, people were very used to preparing for what we used to call a scheduled plan review. So that's what used to happen. We used to have an NDIS plan, and people had different plan lengths. We had 6-month plans, 12-month plans, 2-year plans, but everyone had an end date on their plan. And the idea was that no one should have a gap between their plans. So when the plan was coming to its end, we used to have a scheduled plan review. And that's when everyone had to then scramble to get the evidence that they needed for their plan reviews and have that planning assessment meeting, either with a local area coordinator or an NDIA planner. That has now stopped. That is no longer what happens. And so that's what I really want to share with you guys tonight. So the agency tried to bring in a much more flexible process to having plans looked at and reviewed as a bit of a response to things needing to be more flexible within the COVID-19 pandemic. Let's face it, we're still in that pandemic, but this all started happening last year. So the agency now does not follow the process that it used to. We no longer have scheduled plan reviews for everyone when we get towards someone's end date. That is no longer what happens. What happens now is that people will have a participant check-in. So this is where you are contacted, either the participant or their plan nominee is contacted by a representative of the agency. And it's quite a casual conversation where the representative from the agency is wanting to check in with you and see, how are you going? Is your current plan meeting your support needs? Is your current plan reflective of your goals, or have they changed? A bit of a conversation, just checking in on things. And we now know from, talking to many people who have experienced a check-in, that check-ins will either happen on the phone, or you'll actually receive an email that checks in with you. We're also hearing stories of people who receive a text message from a representative of the agency that then alerts you that a phone call is coming. So there's, again, a bit of inconsistency around how these check-ins happen. So you'll either have a text message that alerts you about a phone call coming, you'll have a phone call, or you'll have an email. And this is all trying to just check in with you around, you know, your well-being, is your current plan meeting your needs? So officially, and you'll see the link at the top here when you get the slides, officially participant check-ins are around trying to make sure that people keep getting the support they need. And apparently participants have told the agency that you want to keep participant check-ins because you like the chance to talk about how things are going, to talk about your current situation, and just to check, you know, are things as they were last time we spoke to you. So that's the official line according to the NDIS website. But what we're seeing in reality is that when people have check-ins, we're seeing, based on just anecdotal evidence from myself and people that I'm working with and friends who are NDIS participants, we're finding that the process is not super clear. So officially, you will get contacted by a representative of the agency. So this will either be a planner, so an NDIA planner, it could be a local area coordinator, or it could actually be a new role. So there's a new role that we've heard of as well now because of this check-in process called a participant support officer. Either way, you're going to be contacted by a representative of the agency. So they're going to make contact with the participant or their nominee to check in on how you're going, how's your well-being, you know, how's the current plan going. The problem that we're finding though is that, you know, in day-to-day life, if someone is checking in on you, it's quite often a casual thing. And so it can feel quite casual when people are having this check-in. And so it might be that, you know, you receive a phone call from the agency and it's a conversation where they're just saying, you know, just checking in on how you're going and how your support's going, how's your NDIS plan going? And the conversation can just feel quite light and quite casual, and it's not made clear that that check-in conversation is actually determining what happens next to your new NDIS plan. It's actually quite a significant conversation, but from the stories that I'm hearing from people who are experiencing these check-ins, the casualness of it is what they're feeling, and they don't realize what this conversation's about. So I'll explain very soon what the check-in is about. So that's the first thing, that a check-in can feel a bit casual, but the participant check-in process is actually quite significant and can have quite significant outcomes in someone's plan. The other thing that we know is that the check-in phone calls are often less than 10 minutes long. So these conversations where you're being checked in on and, you know, to see how you're going, not only do they feel quite casual, but they're quite fast. So it's not necessarily an environment where you feel like you're able to have quite a serious conversation about the options ahead for you. So let's have a look at what the check-in is all about. There are actually 3 options that can happen at a participant check-in. So the first 2 are called plan variations. So the first plan variation is that based on this check-in conversation, it's determined together that actually, yep, my NDIS plan is meeting my goals and my support needs. And yes, actually, I'm happy to have a new NDIS plan with the same or very similar supports to what I have now. So for some people, they love that option because they think, hang on a minute, have I just been able to get a new plan that looks the same without going through the full plan review? Yes, that's right. That's it. Just from having that check-in conversation, some people will able to select, yep, things are meeting my needs, my goals are not changing, things are stable. They then have the option to have a new plan with the same supports. So for some people, they love that. Another option of a plan variation is where there's a new NDIS plan with just very minor changes. Now, I've asked a representative from a local area coordination office, what does minor changes mean? And her answer was that it's most likely a removal of something. So for example, if your current plan that is currently active had some assistive technology funded, and within this plan period, you've purchased that assistive technology. So you don't actually need that repeated in a new plan. So the new plan with minor changes will be that it almost looks the same, but it just won't have that assistive technology funded because you've already bought it this time around and you don't need that to be refunded. So that's one example of a minor change of something that's been removed. The third option is that the person is able to, I guess, state, no, this current plan is not meeting my support needs. No, things are not stable. No, my goals are not going to continue as they are. The idea of a new plan with same or only minor changes is not appropriate for me. I would like to have what I'm used to as a full plan review. Now, what we'll talk about in the next education session in August is that a whole bunch of language has changed. So they're not actually called plan reviews anymore. They're called plan reassessments, but we'll just keep that conversation to August. But for the people at the check-in conversation, for the people who actually say, no, this plan that I currently have that's coming to an end will no longer suit me into the future, they then have the right to say, I want the option to have all of my plan reassessed. So for those people, that will look like what you're used to, the plan review process, where you need to get supporting letters and documentation and reports and all the things you're used to getting, you know, the occupational therapy letters, the speech therapy letters, the psychology letters, all of those things, all of that evidence is required if you take the option of a full plan reassessment, because that's actually the same as what people are used to as having the full plan review. Now, let me check the chat for the moment. Sophie is saying, do the check-ins happen on the anniversary of the end date of the plan? Very good question, Sophie. I can only answer based on friends who have gone through this. And the answer is that there is not consistency in this, and that we are hearing quite a few people are having their check-ins a few months before the plan end date. However, we also have heard stories of, there was a woman in Western Australia who had a 12-month plan and she had her check-in at the 6-month mark. So go figure. There doesn't seem to be a pattern yet. We don't seem to be noticing like a standard operating procedure on the timing of the check-in. So that's, I guess, showing why it's even more important that people understand what a check-in is. Because if you get a random phone call from the agency somewhere within your plan period, you need to be able to go, oh, hang on, is this a check-in? And that's actually what a good friend of mine did, who's a participant. He actually said, wait, is this a check-in? And he was able to feel quite empowered because he then understood what was happening. We then have, oh, Ali, thank you. So Sophie is saying, is it likely that a plan reassessment will result in a decrease in funding? So Sophie, I'm about to show you a checklist in the NDIS legislation, which is critical in understanding how funding decisions are made. But when someone does have their plan fully reassessed, the funding that will end up in that new plan is entirely unpredictable at this stage, because they then need to go and get all the evidence and reports and go through the full reassessment process, which is like having, you know, a brand new assessment, like your first ever experience. You know that every time you've had your plan reviewed, it feels like going through it all again. So it really is determined by the evidence that is presented at that reassessment, Sophie, and I'll show you the checklist in a sec. Maria, if funding isn't used, does that mean that they will decrease the funding? I find that with COVID, we've missed loads. So Maria, if there are unspent funds, you will definitely need to justify why. So they definitely do look at plan utilization. But if funding has not been spent because of the impact of COVID, I would recommend that you need to say more than just that. So instead of saying funds were unspent because of COVID, I would make it much more clear around trying to justify why we still need that funding in the new plan. So for example, Because of restrictions due to COVID-19, my son's day program closed for 6 months because of strict COVID restrictions around group-based supports. That meant that my son was not able to utilize his funding as planned at his last planning meeting. It also meant that it was very difficult to get community-based support because of the lack of access and opportunities for, community or group-based supports that my son is used to. He has now become quite socially isolated, and we've seen a regression in his skills, and we've seen a real disconnection from his peers. And for these reasons, we're actually strongly advocating that, having the funding in the new plan is absolutely necessary and required, because we need to reverse that social isolation, and we need to get, opportunities for his skills and social participation. So don't just say COVID, explain the impact of COVID, and then justify why it's required now. And of course, that's when you need your supporting letters and documentations from the people in their life. BB has said, I got a check-in last month, way before the end of my plan. There you go. And then you've said, I didn't know it was a chat. It was very casual chat. There you go. Thank you. You've just backed up what all my friends are saying, BB. Eric is saying, over the past 2 years, I was not able to do face-to-face, and therefore all the documentation was not read by the assessor. Will face-to-face come back so that we can reinforce my son's needs? I think it's a bit of a case-by-case around the country, Eric. I'm noticing that different partners in the community, different local area coordination officers are making up their own rules around face-to-face versus phone versus, video calls. I know a lot of them in Sydney are using Microsoft Teams, but whatever the mode, you have the right to expect that the assessor is reading and using the evidence provided. So to me, that's actually something you can expect regardless of the mode of the assessment. I'll take a little break from the questions in the chat there and keep going for a moment now. So what are your rights? So the first thing I would say is people need to know, what is a check-in? What are the options at check-in? And what are my rights at check-in? So my good friend that I've been talking about who was called, he was called for his check-in by a private number at 11 a.m. on a Saturday morning, okay? So it's not just weekdays. And he felt very uncomfortable and did not want to go ahead with the check-in. So he had the right, and so do all of you, to request that the check-in occur at a different time when he was able to bring in support people of his choice. So he actually requested a different check-in time when his support coordinator could be there. So the next thing for everyone to take away from here is that absolutely you have the right to reschedule the check-in. You do not have to have it when you receive the phone call if you're not ready and if you don't feel comfortable. The other thing I want to talk about is that there has been new rules around the default length of a plan. So whether you have at the check-in, whether you take the option of a new plan with same supports, new plan with minor changes, or a full plan reassessment, for all of those options, the default plan length now is 2 years. Now, what concerns me is that the way that this is presented sounds very inflexible. So I've heard it said at planning meetings, we're doing 2-year plans now. This is how they say it. And I know because I've heard people on, the assessment meetings on the phone and on video calls, you can actually hear the local area coordinators say, well, the system has defaulted to ticking 2 years on our system. So that's where it automatically is going. So the other thing I want you guys to know around your rights is that you absolutely have the right to have a discussion if you think that 2 years does not work for you. So we know that people can try and advocate and justify a shorter plan period and also a longer plan period. So just be clear that you absolutely have the right to have a conversation and to negotiate a plan length that is different to the default. And just be aware that sometimes the language that's used in the assessment sounds like it's not flexible, but there is the option for the assessor to change what is ticked on the system. So if you're wanting to advocate for a shorter plan, you would be saying things like, I have a disability where my support needs are currently not stable. They're changing. And the idea of me committing to a 2-year plan seems unreasonable because I don't believe that my support needs will stay stable for 2 years, or my goals are not going to be consistent for the next 2 years, or I'm about to go through a very significant transition period. And so I need to have the option to review all of my support needs and goals much sooner than 2 years. So examples of transition periods could be finishing high school, you know, moving into employment, changing where you're living, so possibly moving out of home for the first time. So all of those things that mean that things may not look the same for an extended period of time are ways that you might be able to justify a shorter plan period. Longer plan periods is the opposite. If you say, actually, my goals and support needs have been stable for some time and I anticipate that they will, and I'm actually really comfortable with committing to, you know, funded supports for the next 3 years. So we do know that some people have plan lengths of up to 3 years now. So just know that you have the right to have that conversation as well. So if you are taking the option of having the full plan reassessment, or what you're used to as previously known as a full plan review or the scheduled plan review, make sure you're fully prepared with having a look at your current situation and looking at your current goals and really going through, okay, what are my goals for my next plan period? What do I want to state as my short and medium to long-term goals in the next plan? And this is when, if you have committed to saying at check-in, yes, I want a full plan reassessment, that's when you do need to go down that pathway of gathering all of the evidence from anyone who you want to seek evidence from around the funded supports that you're wanting to try and advocate for in the next plan period. So this is where you may have progress reports from therapists. You know, they often include quotes in those. Look at the service providers where you're using core support. So including detail around the amount of hours, the support ratio, days of the week, all of these things, all of these details are required as you're used to. But just know that if you're selecting full plan reassessment at the check-in, that's when you need to go down this pathway of getting all that evidence, including, do you have assistive technology requirements? Do you have assistive technology that needs to be repaired or replaced or upgraded? All of these things are the things that you need evidence for if you're going to full plan reassessment, because that's what you're used to for the plan reviews. Now, just wanting to give some language here. Apparently it used to be very secret that we weren't allowed to know in the past that the computer system at the NDIS sort of has a background algorithm where typical support packages were sort of generated. So depending on someone's primary diagnosis, their age, whether they live in metro, rural, remote communities, do they have any informal supports, their age, all of these things were all punched into the system, and that generated a TSP, a typical support package. So apparently we're now allowed to talk about that there is such a thing as TSPs. But I guess what we sort of have heard through the grapevine is that there is a very high percentage of plans that need to be approved by planners at the agency that are at the typical support package level. What that means is, I think it's 80 to 90% that planners need to approve plans that are at the typical support package level. So what that means is, if you're someone who wants to try and get, you know, the best plan possible and try and get more than what the computer system is predicting, it just is, I guess, a bit of a hint to us that we need to be even better with our evidence and have even tighter, stronger evidence about the funding you're requesting. So just keep that in mind, that you've sort of got to fight against the computer algorithm that we now know exists for these TSPs. Now, I'm going to come back to this slide because I want to get a bit excited about it, so hold that thought. But just to give you a little bit more detail of the options at the check-in, so just to come back to those. So new plan, same supports, that could be a great choice if the person's plan is meeting their support needs, meeting their goals. This is where you don't need to scramble for all the evidence that you used to. And there's no need to then have a big formal planning meeting that you're used to. Remember that there's a default plan length of 2 years, and there will be indexation of funds. So, you know, each year, we know that costs go up and there's a percentage that's added as an index to the current funds in the plan. So look, for some people, the idea of being able to get a new plan with the same supports for 2 years without going through a plan review, they absolutely love it. They think it's brilliant. However, because these check-in conversations can feel really casual, it might be a risk if people don't understand what the check-in is. It could be that the person gets a phone call, you know, hey, Tanya, just checking, you know, how you're going. Is your plan currently meeting support needs? Just checking on your well-being. If Tanya then says, yeah, oh, yeah, thanks. Oh, that's nice. Thanks for calling. Yeah, no, things are okay. Okay, great. Hang up the phone within less than 10 minutes. Tanya then receives a new plan for 2 years that looks the same as her current plan. And she's like, what just happened? Wait, why do I have the same stuff? I wanted to have a meeting where I talked about how my goals are changing and how I want to move out of home. Yeah, things are okay, but wait, I don't want the same stuff for 2 years. But because it was such a casual little check-in conversation, Tanya didn't know this is my moment to say for the next 2 years, no, things will not actually stay the same. So what I'm finding by talking to friends who are having check-in conversations is that the 3 check-in options are not being explained on the phone calls. So if you're just having a little casual chat, you go, oh yeah, no, things are okay. And without realizing, hang on a minute, is this when I'm supposed to talk about what my plans are for the next 2 years? If you don't know that, you will receive a new plan with the same supports and not really know what happened. New plan, minor changes. It's a great choice if the plan is mostly meeting support needs, and this is where just some minor things might be changed. Like I said, removal of the assistive technology funding, because you don't actually need that to be replicated because you've already bought that piece of equipment. But again, default plan length of 2 years, no need to go through the full planning, the planning meeting with all the evidence. And then just coming back again to when it's a full plan reassessment, this is when, yes, you will need to attend a formal planning meeting. The entire plan will be reassessed. You absolutely need all of the evidence. And this is where if you do have a support coordinator, we're actually being told that support coordination reports are required for any of the check-in options, but we're seeking clarity on that because this is so new, we're not quite clear. But as we were just saying earlier with the questions in the chat, we don't know what will happen to the plan budget. Could be increased, could be decreased, might not change very much. And this is where all of your evidence is key. And again, default plan length of 2 years. So just wanted to give a case study of my friend. I told you that he received his check-in phone call on a Saturday morning. Now it should be known that he has, he's been an NDIS participant from the very beginning. He works within the sector. He's actually a subject matter expert. He's a consultant, very, very informed. And even he found the phone call quite unsettling, and he knows all of his rights, and he still found it a bit unsettling. And so he's actually received quite a few check-in phone calls. And one time when he did say to them, is this a check-in? The planner wouldn't actually commit and wouldn't name it. So we don't know why, but just unsettling for my friend. And when he did say on the phone, I'd like to stop this phone call and reschedule it for when my support coordinator can be present, he sensed that the caller was quite stunned, a bit of a sense of, oh, the planner just wanted to tick this off and move along. So this is a very informed participant who absolutely knows his rights, and he found it a bit difficult to, speak his rights. So this is why it's so critical that people know what this is all about. The phone call took less than 10 minutes when it did happen. And he said that the 3 different options at check-in were not discussed and were not explained. So again, this is why I'm wanting to give you guys this information so that you know if you get that phone call, you can go, hang on a minute, this is when I have to choose between new plan, same supports, new plan, minor changes, or a full plan reassessment. So yeah, he was just saying it was very quick. For him, it happened very close to the end of his plan period. They did have a conversation around whether the goals were the same or different. But again, he said, I only knew what my options were because I'm informed and I work in the sector, not because it was said to me on the phone call. So I guess rather than getting cranky about that, that's why we're then making sure we hopefully teach you guys about what it's all about. So again, just about your rights, you absolutely can request the phone call to happen at a different time. You are allowed to have a support person there with you, even if that means they dial different people in and it's a multi-phone call with different people at different locations. Remember, you absolutely have the right to have a conversation where the plan length may be different to the default. And just be aware that the language around the default will sound like there's no option, but there is. And I know because I've experienced it this year with many people having that conversation and having shorter plan lengths. And the other thing that we'll talk about in the August Zoom is no matter what you choose at the check-in, you still will have the option if things change for you once the new plan has started. You absolutely still have the right and the option to flag with the agency if there has been a change in your situation. So of course, it doesn't mean you're stuck with something for 2 years. If your support needs change, if your supports at home change, if there's a change to your diagnosis, all of these things, of course, can be flagged with the agency. So it's not a set and forget situation. What the decision you make at check-in does not necessarily mean it's going to be the thing that you have for 2 years, because you still have the right throughout the next period to highlight if there have been changes in your support needs. The other thing we would say is that if there's been a change in your situation already and you already know this, you don't have to wait to be contacted for your check-in. You can be proactive. So all of the stuff we've been talking about here around participant check-in is initiated by the agency. So it's initiated by a planner, a local area coordinator, or a participant support officer. So it's all initiated by the agency. But what we'll talk about in the August meeting is, all of your rights around you initiating this stuff. So you can actually say, hey, agency, there's been a change in my support needs. I'd like to request a variation to my plan or for my plan to be reassessed. You don't have to wait to be contacted for your check-in if there's been changes. You can actually initiate that. And we'll go through the new change in situation form in the August Zoom. The other thing we'll say is if you or the person that you're supporting has really specific communication support needs, make sure that they are documented on file within the agency, because otherwise there's a risk that the person will be contacted by the agency in a way that doesn't suit their communication support needs. So, for example, it may be much better for the person to receive an email and have things explained in writing. And if they get a phone call check-in, it might be overwhelming. They may not be able to process the information in a fast phone call. And so they say, no, I'm okay, thanks, thank you very much. And then they get a new plan with same supports because they weren't able to process the check-in verbally. So if there are communication requirements, make sure that that's on file and up to date with the agency. Now I'm going to go to the chat. Okay, Karen is saying, my plan was due for renewal at the beginning of July, but I haven't heard from the NDIA or check-in. I sent in all reports before the end date. My plan was extended, but I want to change my goals as they are quite different from my first plan and I require extra funding. Okay, so what I'm thinking is happening, Karen, is we have been made aware of admin issues, logistics issues within the agency. Basically, they've actually admitted that they've had staffing issues. And so what's actually been happening to some people is that when their plan is coming to its end date, it automatically extends. And that happens automatically to make sure that people don't have a gap in their plans. So if your plan automatically extends, it happens when it was due for its end date, and then an additional 12 months is added to the plan. Now that's a plan extension, or it sometimes used to be called a rollover. You still have the right though to have a check-in or to say that you would like to have a plan reassessment. So I'll give you an example of this, of something that happened locally to where I work in Sydney. A young woman I was working with, her plan end date was, I think it was the 2nd of February. But before Christmas last year, the local area coordination office already knew that they had staffing issues in the new year. They already could tell her, we do not have enough staff to do your full plan reassessment before the 2nd of February. So what's going to happen is you're going to have a full plan extension. Your plan will be extended for 12 months, but we've heard you and we understand that you do want a full plan reassessment because she was absolutely about to go through a huge transition. So they then booked in her full plan reassessment in April. So she then knew, okay, good, I'm not going to have a gap in my funding. And I know that I will have the opportunity to have my plan fully reassessed. I know that I need to get all of my evidence together before that date in April, but at least I know I won't have a gap in my plan. Now, for any of you who are feeling a little bit cheeky and you want to understand how to play the game, you might think, hang on a minute, that person had her plan extended for 12 months in February, but she was having her plan fully reassessed in April, which was going to then give her a new plan. So really, in effect, when it was extended in February, she had 12 months worth of funding that she actually had access to between February and April, because she knew she was going to have her full plan reassessed and then a new plan after that in April. So she was very clever and she thought, hang on a minute, I've got an additional 12 months worth of funding that only needs to last 2 months. So she then went and got lots and lots of comprehensive assessments around her goals. So assistive technology assessments and reports, home and living assessments and reports, occupational therapy, functional capacity assessments, all of these things that are expensive, but they were required. But she was very clever and she thought, this is my opportunity. I've had 12 months of funding extended, but I only need it for 2 months. So keep that in mind. So Karen, I would say that you've had a plan extension automatically, maybe because of staffing, and it would be worth saying, I understand my plan's been extended automatically, but I know that I have the right to a full plan reassessment. If you're used to having local area coordinators doing your assessments, I would call your local area coordinator, so your partner in the community, wherever you are in the country. Let me have a look. Sophie's saying, can they reduce funds on a plan when the support needs remain the same? Look, the NDIS is very focused on the I in NDIS, insurance. So the I in NDIS is all around insurance and building capacity and really wanting to see a return on the funding. So that's why we're always hearing people in the NDIS talking about capacity building. So if there is not enough evidence to show that the support needs are continuing, then the NDIS would be hoping that the funded supports that the person's been having has built their capacity, and maybe their funded support needs would be reducing over time. That's their dream. They want it to be an insurance model. So if your support needs are remaining the same, then you just need to make sure you have very, very clear, tight evidence that advocate and justify that the funding does not reduce. And that's what all the reports are required about. Eric said the 2-year duration was tried on me in February and I said no. Even when the LEC rang us up, he even started saying that this would be for 2 years. I said no to this and we received a 1-year plan. Eric, self-advocacy, absolutely love it. See, you knew your rights and you kept going and you won. So well done, very awesome. So BB saying that you felt unhappy and about the vague check-in. Can I complain about it? You absolutely have the right to complain if you felt that your experience at your check-in was not a positive one, and if you didn't feel informed, BB, yeah, absolutely, you have the right to complain. So I'm now going to go back to the slide that I skipped before. For the last 10 minutes, I just want to get super geeky with you all. And and explain to you a very critical part of the NDIS legislation and how it relates to full plan reassessments. Now, for those who feel super geeky and want to do this in more detail, one of our monthly Zooms before the end of the year will be just about the legislation, the NDIS rules, and how understanding that can help you negotiate funding. So we're going to actually spend a whole hour on this before the end of the year. But just quickly, I want to stop sharing the slides and share with you the legislation. So some of you know me, and some of you know that I'm unapologetic about my geekiness. And that's because it's related to you feeling empowered and feeling that you can be the smartest person in the room. So we have the NDIS Act of 2013. Within the Act, there are many, many, many sections. Section 34 is possibly one of the most important sections for us all to understand and feel very intimately connected with, because Section 34 is related to what we know as the reasonable and necessary supports. So when decisions are being made at the agency about what funding is going to end up in someone's plan, any dollar that ends up in someone's plan must meet all 6 criteria in the reasonable and necessary checklist from the Act. So things that are funded in the NDIS plan are not random, okay? Anything that's funded has been assessed by a planner that it meets reasonable and necessary criteria. So for those of you who have been in planning meetings and the planner or the local area coordinator says something about, oh, that's not reasonable and necessary, or, you know, we have to check if that meets R&N, this is what they're talking about. So planners make their decisions about what funding ends up in your plans based on these 6 criteria. So like I said, we're going to spend a whole hour on all of this stuff because it's quite detailed, but I want to just at least let you know what these are in case you've never heard of them before. And the reason why it's important is because when we talk about the check-in, if you take the option to have a full plan reassessment and you're going to then collect reports, and documents and supporting letters, all of those documentation need to address all 6 of these criteria. Otherwise, you pretty much can guarantee it might not get funded. So the planners need to be very, very satisfied that all 6 of these criteria are met before they fund something. And the only way they can understand if it does meet the criteria is from the evidence you provide. So let's have a look at the 6 criteria. So for something to be funded, all 6 criteria need to be met, not just a few, all 6 of them, okay? So first of all, the support you're requesting to be funded must be aligned to your NDIS disability related goals, which is why writing your goal statements and having really clear goal statements for your short and medium to long-term goals are critical. We then need to have evidence that the funding you're requesting is going to facilitate your social and economic participation. So I'll give you an example of a report that I was sort of coaching a physio on. So there was a physio report that someone got for their plan reassessment, and the physio was writing the report as if they were speaking to other physios. And I was like, no, you need to speak NDIS. You can't speak physio. So for example, the physio had put all of these results in the report around the person's 6-minute walk test and how long it took them to do a timed up and go test. And I just said to them very politely, no one cares. The person at the agency does not know what that means. No one knows what the results of that timed up and go test means in relation to their social and economic participation. So then when you dig further, the physio says, well, the result that they got in that test is actually evidence-based that they have a much higher risk of falling. And you're like, okay, now we're talking. So therefore, you're saying that because of their results, they are a much higher falls risk. Therefore, the physio that you're recommending is actually trying to reduce the person's risk of falling, increase their safety so that they can participate in the community. So we need to make sure that the reports are translated to NDIS. If you just send in a result of someone's 6-minute walk test with no context, the decision maker at the agency does not know how that relates to their social and economic participation. We then need to justify that the supports being requested represent value for money. in that the costs of the support are reasonable relative to both the benefits achieved and the cost of alternative support. I'll give you an example of how a friend of mine justified value for money. He is someone who has a physical disability where he needs support to be transferred into bed at the end of the day. And he lives in an apartment with his wife. And if he's transferred into his bed and his wife is not there and the support worker leaves, if the support worker forgets to turn off the lights or leaves the TV remote out of a reaching distance of my friend, he is not able to turn the lights off or turn the TV off. And for that to happen for him, he needs to call an after-hours support worker service to get a support worker to come back and do a 1-minute job. And his plan is then charged for at least an hour, right? So he was able to justify value for money by putting an argument forward around having assistive technology in his apartment where lights and electronics were automated through his iPad and through his phone, so that that upfront cost of whatever it was to put in that system now means it's value for money, because that one-off cost means he now no longer needs to call back one-on-one support workers at night anymore. So yes, there was an upfront cost, but it's still value for money because he was able to compare the two different supports. We then need to show that the support that's being requested or recommended is likely to be effective and beneficial, having regard to current good practice. So this is often shown by having an evidence base. So I'm getting much more, my expectations of reports from therapists now are getting much higher. And that's because decisions at the agency are getting a lot stricter. So if a physiotherapist is going to recommend in their report that I get weekly physiotherapy, I now say to them, is there a journal article that you know of, that you have access to, that shows the evidence of why me with my disability requires weekly physiotherapy intervention? Because if there is, you need to put that in. There needs to be evidence of what is current good practice. And so I have done that now for about a year with therapists, and the reports that are coming back are having exceptional evidence base now. We have therapists who are putting in reference lists, journal article links. So it's much more clear that they're not just making stuff up, they're actually backing up their recommendations with evidence. The next point is that the planner will only fund something if they're satisfied that it's not the responsibility of someone else to do it. And in this case, that it's not the responsibility of the person's community and informal supports or carers. So this is where a carer impact statement can be really helpful, because this is where an informal support or a carer can clearly state what is and is not reasonable to expect of them. So this is all around what is reasonable to expect of families, carers, and communities. So like I said, we'll go into this in a lot more detail when we do the reasonable and necessary Zoom. But you have the right, if any of you here are informal supports or carers, you have the right to state what is and is not reasonable to expect of you. Because if you've been doing something for some time and it is no longer reasonable to expect that of you, but the person still requires that support, that can then lead to increase in funding. If the person still needs it and it's no longer reasonable to expect that of you, the person still needs the support. So that could be one way to justify that the funded support is required. Now, this one here is a conversation on its own, and we will do this in the Zoom where we talk about legislation. The planner will only put funding in the plan if they're satisfied that it is not the responsibility of a different government department or a different government bucket of money. So if the support or service already exists in another government department or government bucket of money, then you must get it from there. The NDIS will not fund it. So I will show you a wonderful resource when we do the Zoom on that to show you how you can actually try and determine whose responsibility is it. So that's coming. But just wanted to show you guys, if you do have a check-in and you do choose the option of a full plan reassessment, you then need to have all of the evidence towards what funding you're requesting meet all 6 of these reasonable and necessary criteria. Look at that, we're almost at time and we have one question. Does a link exist to get to articles that show evidence-based that other NDIS participants have used? Maria, no, because you wouldn't be able to see evidence that other participants have used. But if you're working with a therapist who is making recommendations for your support and funding, then it's within your rights to ask them to provide evidence backing up what they're recommending for you. Of course, it's in your best interest, but also it's in their best interest, right? Because if they do an amazing report that covers all of the evidence for what they're recommending, it's more likely that you'll get the funding, which means it's more likely that they'll get funded by you, right? So it's a win-win. So I can't believe we made it with 2 minutes to go. I just want to reiterate that it's really, 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 really critical that you have the information you need so that you do feel empowered and informed at your planning meetings, because too often I've seen in planning meetings language used that is so random. It's the NDIS has its own language. So if there are people in an assessment and they say, oh, well, you know, we're having a check-in and we're going to talk about a check-in and plan reassessment and you know, we're going to talk about reasonable and necessary. None of that is in our regular day-to-day language. So if it's not explained to you, you can't actually have full choice and control. So of course the NDIS wants people to have choice and control, but you can't say that unless you explain the system. Otherwise this is tokenistic. So I guess we're hoping that these sessions can make you be the expert in the room.